All right, everybody, let's start the afternoon session. To moderate this session, I'm delighted to have Katrina Wyman here. She is the Sarah Herring Soren Professor of Law and Director of the Environmental and Energy Law LLM program at NYU. She is also the Energy Program Director at the Guarini Center, and I'm very excited that she can be here to moderate our discussion today. Her research focuses on the interplay of property rights, natural resources, law, and policy. She has published works on impacts of and responses to migration caused by climate change, which have been published in the Harvard Environmental Law Review, Florida Law Review, and Cambridge University Press.
Thank you very much, Burchin. Thank you for organizing as well. So our panel today, this afternoon, is going to focus on time-variant pricing issues and options. And we're going to discuss on this panel some of the sort of common concerns with time-variant pricing and some of the issues that may arise in implementing it. So Sanam Sarghiti is going to discuss the effects of time-variant pricing for low-income people. Carol Miller is going to discuss some of the environmental implications of time-variant pricing, and in particular, how we might be able to measure those environmental implications. And Suzanne Russo is going to discuss the role of enabling technologies in time-variant pricing. So I'm going to begin by introducing each of the three speakers. Then they will speak, and then we will have Q&A at the end. So as in the morning, cards will be distributed, and you can please write your question on the card, and also to who the question is addressed, and then they'll be aggregated up at the front here. So let me start first with Dr. Sanam Sarghiti. She is a senior associate at the Brattle Group. There, she leverages her expertise in energy efficiency, demand response, and customer behavior, combined with applied econometrics, to assist utilities in the design and implementation of time-variant pricing programs and related pilots. Dr. Sarghiti has designed and evaluated the Smart Energy Pricing Pilot for BG&E, which we heard about this morning, and co-authored the State of Connecticut's annual Integrated Resource Plan. She received her PhD in Applied Econometrics from Northeastern University. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Carol Miller, who's a professor of civil and environmental engineering. She's the chair of the Standing Committee on Environmental Initiatives and also the co-director of the Urban Watershed Environmental Research Group at Wayne State University. Her recent research has addressed the issues of emissions from power generation, real-time systems for water distribution, and the effect of varying prices on emissions. She's received grants and conducted research projects for EPA, the National Science Foundation, and the Great Lakes Protection Fund. Dr. Miller has a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And finally, Suzanne Russo is Chief Operating Officer for Pecan Street. Ms. Russo helps lead the organization in its mission of addressing water and energy challenges by promoting and informing technology solutions. Prior to joining the organization, she was the Director of Sustainability Initiatives at New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, where she led the development of green buildings and sustainable retrofit standards for municipally funded affordable housing. She has a master's degree in community and regional planning from UT Austin. Okay, so let me begin with Dr. Sarghiti.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I don't know if it's a good thing to come right after lunch or to have spoken before lunch, but I guess we'll see. Expecting lots of good questions. I'm going to talk about one of the most contentious subjects in the context of time-varying pricing today, which is low-income customers and their response to time-varying pricing and the issues, concerns, and opportunities with their experience with time-varying pricing. I was actually hoping that there would be a consumer advocate in the panel so that they could list out all the concerns, and I would just come along and talk about the contrary evidence, but not having a consumer advocate in the panel, I'll try to do a fair job of listing those concerns as well as offering some evidence that some of those concerns are not justified or there's not evidence that those are materializing. With that, quick look at my outline. I will briefly talk about the premise of time varying pricing. Not going to spend a lot of time here because we've already heard a lot about this in the morning. And then I will discuss the consumer advocate concerns with time varying pricing, and I'll present some contrary evidence. Then I will discuss some mitigating options to avoid or offset the potential adverse impacts of time varying pricing. So time varying pricing has garnered a lot of interest over the, across the US and elsewhere over the past decade. We've seen lots of pilots, lots of demonstrations, and this is mainly because time varying pricing has the potential to introduce a lot of benefits for the society. The first one is the avoided or deferred transmission, distribution, and generation costs. To the extent that these costs are avoided or deferred, the revenue requirements are lower. That eventually turns into lower rates for customers. So when the second one is the potentially reduced wholesale market prices. When the demand during the most expensive hours are reduced, then that also reduces the price in those most expensive hours. Then, consumer and customer bill reductions. In the short term, those are bill savings, but in the long run, as the load factor improves, that means lower revenue requirements and lower rates. And also, time varying pricing makes distributed generation technology is more attractive for the customers, such as rooftop PVs and energy storage, because that lets them avoid those high prices and shift their usage to lower price hours. And finally, there are some potential environmental benefits to the extent that there is some conservation or energy is shifted to those hours where lower emission plants are on the margin. So again, Ahmed talked about this, Steve talked about this in the morning panels. We've learned a lot from the time varying pricing pilots over the past decade. An overwhelming amount of those cases, the customers do respond to the prices. Some respond a lot, some respond less, some do not respond. But there is a really good evidence that customers do respond to these prices. And but there's much more to the equation. These impacts persist over years, over events. Enabling technologies boosts the price responsiveness, and the price responsiveness depends on the temperature and humidity. We've also seen over and over that decisions made during the implementation planning period can dramatically impact the results. The simplicity of the program design, the activities raising customer awareness, how much education they get, like Wayne mentioned that their customers receive immediate feedback after their participation in the peak time rebate program. So these customers know and remember what they have done, and then they could take better actions, or they could learn from what they haven't done and basically turn these into permanent behavior changes. And it's also important whether a program is opt-in or opt-out in terms of system impacts. So despite striking outcomes of these pilots, time varying pricing is slow to gain traction. 33% of the nation's 140 million households are on smart meters. This number is increasing by day. But only 2% of these customers are on time varying pricing, and only 1% is on dynamic pricing rates. So what that means is that we're not able to fully harness the benefits of time varying pricing. We can't take advantage of lower energy costs. We can't avoid cross subsidies, which are generally in the direction of lower income customers subsidizing higher income customers, as is with the current flat rates right now. So there are various barriers to the implementation of time varying pricing, such as lack of smart meters and regulatory issues. But again, the one I will talk about today is the concerns about the impacts on low-income customers. So what I'll do in the next couple of slides is that I will raise most commonly voiced concerns that we hear from the consumer advocates when it comes to low-income customer participation, and then I will present some contrary evidence to, to alleviate or offset some of these concerns. The first concern is that time-varying pricing is unfair to low-income customers, and the unfairness in time-varying pricing really rests on the assumption that flat rates are fair. But in fact, the opposite is true. It's a very well-kept secret that under a flat rate, customers who consume more electricity during peak periods rely on customers who consume less electricity during those peak periods. So in other words, the peaky customers are financed by the flat consumption customers. And these flat consumption customers are more likely to be low-income customers. So there are implicit cross-subsidies going from the low-income customers potentially to the higher-income customers, and these are embedded in the flat rates. So time-varying pricing avoids this cross-subsidy issue by attributing the costs to those customers who cause those costs. The second concern, which is frequently voiced by the consumer advocates, is that time-varying pricing makes heating and cooling unaffordable for low-income and other vulnerable customers. But what I would say is that time-varying pricing may actually lower the cost of cooling and heating if low-income customers can pre-cool or preheat their residences outside the peak window. It's really based on the information that these customers would get. If there's a good outreach and good education of the customers, and if they can learn, if they can hear tips and behavior changes, for behavior changes where they would pre-cool, preheat during these, before these peak windows, they could actually save in their monthly bills. And this is largely because these customers are also more likely to have flatter than average load shapes, because many of these customers lack air conditioning. So what that means is that since they already have flatter than average load profiles, they are likely to be instant winners on their time-varying prices, which I will talk about more in the coming slides. The third concern is that low-income customers may reduce energy for their essential use and may cause themselves physical harm. So it's stated that being strapped for cash, these customers really pull the plugs on things and sit in the dark and really try to conserve to a level where they inflict harm on themselves. This is something that we hear a lot, but I personally am not aware a documented instance of a low-income or vulnerable customers harming themselves while they are trying to participate in the time-varying pricing program. And having said that, it's possible to identify these customers, low-income customers, vulnerable customers, and shelter them from the potential adverse impacts of time-varying pricing with ratepayer subsidized bill payment assistance programs, and Ahmed mentioned energy stamps. So, these customers, each utility has its own version of low-income customer rate. There could be outreach programs that can be implemented through, community centers, churches, and other, neighborhood organizations. That there are ways to really shelter these customers from any potential harmful impact of time-varying pricing. So then the next one is that the argument that less well-off customers lack the sophistication and discretionary load to respond to time-varying pricing. So this is basically saying that the low-income customers lack the know-how and the sophistication to take actions to deal with time-varying pricing. But the empirical evidence suggests that this is not the case. A few years ago, we did a white paper for Institute for Electric Efficiency, And we have identified 7 time-varying pricing pilots or programs that provide data on low-income customers' responsiveness to time-varying pricing. And based on this data, the proposition that the low-income customers do not and cannot respond is not verified. So here's an interesting chart. So again, these bars are coming from 7 pilots, but some pilots have more tests of these low-income customer responsiveness. So there are 10 bars here. So if a bar has 100%, that means that for that particular test, low-income customers responded as much as an average customer. So in other words, let's look at BG's 2008 test of low-income customer responsiveness. And in that year, that particular test, low-income customers were equally responsive as the average customer. In 3 out of 10 tests, low-income customers were equally responsive. And in the 7 out of that 10 cases, low-income customers were less responsive than an average customer, but they still responded. And I guess we should add one more bar to this chart based on Steve's talk this morning. He mentioned that in SMOD's case, low-income customers were also equally responsive as the average customers, and they opted in more and that they opted out less from the time-varying pricing program. So this is a really clear evidence that low-income customers do not lack the know-how and sophistication to respond to these rates. What's more surprising is that most low-income customers will actually be better off under time-varying pricing due to their flat load profiles even before doing anything. So what that means is that I keep mentioning that their load profiles are flatter and more favorable. To sort of prove this point, we took a small sample of low-income customers from a large urban utility, and we simulated their monthly bills using a revenue-neutral critical peak pricing rate. And we have seen that 80% of the low-income customers were immediately better off under time-varying pricing. And after, if you assume a really moderate 10% reduction in peak usage, the 90% of the low-income customers were better off after enrolling in time-varying pricing. I mean, obviously these numbers would change based on the rate design, but there's very strong evidence that at least more than 50% of the low-income customers would immediately be better off under time-varying pricing. And I'm defining being better off in the sense that their monthly bills would go down as a result. So the next concern is that, it's all good and there's evidence that the customers respond, but the results are based on a small sample of volunteers who receive extensive hand-holding during the pilot programs. And it's true that in some of these pilots, the sample sizes are smaller than the ideal, but those low-income customers are recruited in the same way that the average customer is recruited, and they receive the same education that an average customer receives. So that should not affect the relative magnitude of the response between low-income and average customers. But granted, you could always design a more focused and targeted pilot program that specifically addresses the low-income customers and get the level of certainty and the precision that you want from such a pilot. But I should also mention that any full-scale time-varying pricing implementation will have a comprehensive customer outreach component. Ahmed talked about OGs, having the billboards and the TV ads. Wayne mentioned that they are running TV ads, notifying customers about time-varying pricing. So these are all going to be in action when time-varying pricing is deployed. So the customers will get their fair share of education on these rates. So finally, after listing all these concerns, usually the biggest point is that because of those reasons, the time-varying pricing should not be made the default rate, that if it's going to be offered, it should only be offered on an opt-in basis. And it's obviously a choice that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but we've seen based on the previous presentations that participation rates remain particularly low in the opt-in time-varying pricing programs. And that's the case even after aggressive customer outreach and customer recruiting. And, Salt River Project, Arizona Public Service achieved really good outcomes, but, those programs have been implemented for over 20 years now, and we'll get to a point where there's a lot of demand response with the opt-in programs over a much longer period of time if those are deployed on an opt-in basis. And obviously the system impacts will be a lot different under opt-in versus default. So, what are some, we've gone through those concerns, and I personally think that most of those concerns are not going to materialize in reality, and like everything else, there will be some customers who will be worse off, and that there are mechanisms out there to make sure that those customers are compensated or offset. So I will talk about several of those mitigating options to avoid potential adverse impacts of time-varying pricing. So I think the first one and one of the most important ones is to create customer buy-in from the get-go. What this means is that customers should be given the right expectations about the time-varying pricing, that they should be really educated about the benefits, how they should be responding, what are the actions that they should take to benefit from these programs. And without that education and the buy-in, it's likely that the most of the benefits will not be obtained. And if especially this is important for low-income customers, because those customers may not have most immediate access to some of the information outlets that average customers have. So there could be programs that are specifically designed for low-income customers and other vulnerable customers to create their buy-in and educate them. And the second one is offering tools again, to deal with or to benefit from time-varying pricing. At the minimum, these should include tips about how they should change their consumption habits, how much consumption certain appliances in their homes are adding to their monthly bills, what are the major actions that they could take. So in the next level, they could be brochures and in-home displays to help these customers manage the time-varying pricing in their daily lives, so that they will not be inconvenienced by time-varying pricing. And then the next one is designing two-part rates. So what happens under two-part rates is that customers can choose their own baseline. And so for that baseline, they could have flat prices. And then for the second part of their consumption, they could be exposed to time-varying pricing. So the customers can choose their baseline amount. If they don't feel totally comfortable with time-varying pricing, they could have a large baseline where they have flat prices, and they could only be subject to time-varying pricing for a little portion of their consumption. And over time, as they get more comfortable with time-varying pricing, they could reduce their baseline consumption and move most of their consumption to time-varying pricing. Then the other option is the peak time rebates. As Wayne mentioned, they're doing it for their entire population. This could be offered to peak time rebates can be offered to low-income customers, or if a utility is implementing a default critical peak pricing program, low-income customers can opt out to peak time rebates, because that's the no-lose proposition. If they don't change their usage, they don't, pay more than what they would have paid, but if they reduce their consumption, they earn rebates. Obviously, there are issues with peak time rebates, like administratively determined baselines. They could be pretty cumbersome to calculate, but again, a good option, especially for low-income customers. And there's another rate form called demand subscription service, which is very similar to the two-part rates. Customers, again, can choose their the portion of their consumption under flat rates versus time varying pricing. The next one is the bill protection, which some of the panelists talked about it in the morning. So the customers can be promised that their bills will not be higher than what they would have paid under flat rates for, let's say, for the first year or for the first couple of years of their participation. And then that bill protection can be phased over time, ideally over 5 years, that they would be exposed to 100% time varying pricing. And the other option that could be used to mitigate some of the potential adverse impacts is that crediting the unneeded hedging premium back to the customers, and especially low-income customers, because under flat rates, the suppliers assume all the risk, or all the volume and price risk. But when we move from flat rates to time varying pricing, that risk is reduced. Therefore, the insurance premiums are not needed, or not needed as much as they were needed before. So the utility can return some of these unneeded hedging premiums back to the customers. And finally, the vulnerable customers can opt out and can be provided bill payment assistance rather than trying to design a program, you design a universal program that will fit to the needs of low-income and vulnerable customers, that these customers can be handled separately, and they could be given exceptions in their, within their specific circumstances. And, just to sum up, I personally think that, it took us a long time to gain some momentum in time varying pricing, and that momentum should not be slowed down due to concerns with low-income and vulnerable customer responsiveness to time varying pricing. I'm not saying that these things should be ignored, but that they could be handled through other mitigating measures that I've just talked about. And also, evidence very clearly shows that the low-income customers have generally favorable profiles, and they do respond to time varying pricing. And we've been talking about whether there are more pilots needed, probably not, because we've already done a lot over the past, 10 years. But if, there will be more tests, it could be on, it could be doing pilots and focus groups with targeted low-income customer groups to gauge the effectiveness of various mitigating options. And I have to emphasize this one more time, that customer education is essential and must be introduced before introducing time varying pricing, because you only have one chance to get it right. This is all. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Slides are already there. Okay. Which one's this? Should say March 31st right there. This one. Yep. Okay. So I'll tell you 10 minutes and 5 minutes. Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol Miller. I'm from Wayne State University in Detroit. And I'd like to just start out by giving my thanks to EDF as well as New York University, the School of Law. It's a lot of fun being here, even if I did have to catch a flight at 6 a.m. this morning. But other than that, it's fun. It was sunny when I got here, but it was snowing in Detroit, and it's spring. So it looked more like spring here. But anyhow, thanks to you all. It's a great venue here. As you heard, I'm an engineer, and engineering speaking venues never look this good. We always have exposed rafters and concrete walls, and I'm going to tell my daughter to be a lawyer. This looks much nicer. Anyhow, I could go on and on about that. The U of M Law School is where I like to go, and at the library is where I like to go and do my work, because I never want to go to the engineering library. Anyhow, that's for another day. So today I'm going to be talking about real-time emissions for next generation energy management. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the relevance of this topic to environmental nuances of time-variant pricing. I became involved recently with EDF through some of the type of work you're going to be seeing here, and in particular in Illinois, where there is some controversy associated to the development of a metric for GHG emissions. The question being, one of the questions they're looking at is how do we determine whether or not the use of smart meters are helping the environment or not. And there's a list of all sorts of metrics they're going to have to look at, and one of them is actually to account for greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the issues that they were having in Illinois is that there's really no way to do that very accurately. I mean, you can use national averages of emissions for different types of fuels, and you can assume what types of generators are online at any particular point in time, but there really isn't again, a very scientific and rigorously validated approach that can be used to make concrete statements about emissions advantages or emissions devantages. So that's how EDF became involved in some of the work that we're doing, and I believe that's why I was invited today. So before I get started, I also want to apologize in advance for using slides. I didn't realize that the venue was going to be quite this large with, relatively small screens up here. And in the morning session, I was standing in the back, and it was hard for me to see what the speakers had up on the screens. So I tried to very quickly, in the last hour, increase the font size. But again, I apologize if you can't see everything I have up here. I was told that these slides are going to be published on the website somewhere. So I also encourage you to look for the slides. I also, there's a lot of seats up here. So if you're interested in the topic and you want to see the slides, you always can do that by coming up front. So without further ado, all right, so this work that I'm going to be showing today, it's been completed through a variety of engineering disciplines at Wayne State University in Detroit. We're mostly known for our mechanical engineering because of the auto companies, but we actually do a lot in power systems also at Wayne State University, and I got hooked up with those folks for this project. In addition, we're working with a 501c3 in Detroit called EcoWorks that does a lot of work on energy efficiency. And we're funded by the Great Lakes Protection Fund out of Evanston, Illinois. And they have been very generous with us. We have a whole variety of partners that we're working with on this project. And I'm hoping you can actually see that from where you're sitting. All of these partners are very important. I guess for this particular crowd, I might point out that it's interesting to know that we actually have two of the ISOs on our advisory board, MISO and PJM. New York ISO is actually an ISO we're also working in, but I don't yet have somebody from New York ISO on our advisory board, and I would love to get that. So if you are here, I'd love to talk to you. We have a few regional utilities, Consumers Energy and DTE, and then a variety of other groups that are involved in our project. So what I wanted to start with here is sort of a question for us all to think about. How would I find out, or how would you find out about what your marginal emissions are? And I guess the first thing is to define what is meant by marginal. I think most everybody here probably knows that, but I'm guessing there are a few people who don't know how that word marginal is used. And so the question here relates not to gross pollution or gross overall emissions, but the question relates to what is the impact of my next incremental use of energy. That's a much different question than, you know, what's my total carbon footprint, or how much crap am I putting into the atmosphere? The question is important because as you, as a consumer, are making a decision about your next energy move, whether that is plugging in your laptop or whether you're Ford Motor Company and it's whether you add another shift of workers or whatever it is at whatever scale, if you're trying to make that in an environmentally conscious way, you need to know what are the emissions associated with that at a particular location at a particular time. And so that's what's meant by marginal emissions. How would we know that? Is there anything that tells us that on our utility bill? No. So I was just scanning through a lot of different utility bills, and we're all familiar with O-Power doing some really cool stuff these days in terms of putting some peer pressure on your energy bill to try to you know, potentially get us to be a little bit more efficient and to compare well with our neighbors. But even that doesn't show anything about marginal emissions. So the question is, if we're going to look at a new policy, or a new approach, whether that's time variant pricing or whatever it is, how can we get a handle on what the environmental implications of that are if we don't have a way to measure what the marginal emissions are or the changes in the marginal emissions? That's the real problem here. There really is no transparency out there. In fact, I'll stop there for now. So what our sponsor, Great Lakes Protection Fund, and let me just say a word about them. Great Lakes Protection Fund is a consortium of the 8 Great Lakes states. The advisory board is the governor of each of the 8 Great Lakes states. And the Great Lakes Protection Fund is very concerned about deposition of mercury into the Great Lakes. That was the original genesis of us getting involved with them, because some of us have a lot of experience in mercury and power plant production of mercury. But as we got into the project with them, we expanded our range of pollutants, and we became much more focused on greenhouse gas emissions as well as mercury and lead and some others. So we became involved with them primarily initially to help the health of the Great Lakes in terms of coming up with approaches that can be used to determine better ways to dispatch energy. So here, everybody here is mostly talking about the demand side response rather than changes in the dispatch models, which are, you know, economic dispatch, optimized dispatch models primarily. But Great Lakes Protection Fund is out looking at, well, what can be done more on the dispatch side and as well as the demand side. So environmentally sensitive electricity is what we are working on. The idea being, if you're making a decision about electricity use, you should have at your disposal information about the environmental implications. So if I can, I'm not sure without a mouse. Forgotten how to use the mouse pad. Can you just use the arrow? Well, there's a video I was going to run here that maybe I can. All right, here we go. So this is not as cool as I've let it to sound like, but anyhow, so here we're looking at a smokestack from a power plant, and you can see the pollutants being emitted, but you see on the left there that are 3 different types of generators or 3 different types of fuels, however you want to look at it. And you'll notice that if our interest is mercury, we could put some sort of a sensor into our freezer or refrigerator that would sense when the mercury being emitted at that particular time is especially high, or when the NOx or SOx or CO2. So we would have that information, or more likely, something that is automated would have that information, like the defrost component on your refrigerator. So you could determine, well, is it mercury, is it lead, is it carbon? What is it that I'm most concerned about? Because that's another important issue that we all have to grapple with. Emissions aren't just sort of a plume and that we're worried about the whole plume. I mean, to really do this the right way, you need to know what are you trying to target. And so that was supposed to be ESE 101. That's the first class in ESE, is that the type of generator makes a difference in terms of what the marginal emissions are. So the marginal generator is the one that will respond to the next incremental load demand at a particular point. And what we're doing is we're trying to figure out algorithms that will relate the next use of energy to the marginal emissions that are created by that use of energy. It's a very tough problem. To solve that, you have to know what the marginal generator is providing the next amount of energy. So that's what we're doing, and it's quite unique from what there are a lot of approaches out there, a lot of emissions calculators and so on, but they all use, except one or two, they all use an averaging sort of approach. So our approach is currently based on knowledge of locational marginal prices, LMPs. There was at least one speaker earlier this morning that was talking about locational marginal prices, and knowledge of the LMPs, that is the actual real-time at 5-minute increments, cost of energy at different commercial pricing nodes in the region of interest, that's what we need to, that sort of intel is what we need to have in our modeling. So some of you might be saying, wow, this is, why do we have to go into all this detail? And we don't have to, other than I think it's really important for all of us to have an understanding of how complex this is. Why is that? Because one of the questions, or one of the primary arguments against time-variant pricing is that time-variant pricing is going to be bad for the environment. There's just no question. Time-variant pricing will cause an increase in the emissions. That's one of the strongest, or one of the loudest ones I've heard, arguments against time-variant pricing. That argument is based on the assumption that lower price energy is more polluting. And so if we give people information about the price of energy and allow people to, choose, which I would, the lowest price, that means there's going to be more emissions from it. So there are a lot of naysayers out there who suggest that time-variant pricing, again, is going to be bad for the environment. I say no. And I think people who make that argument, they're not looking at this in such a detailed way that really needs to be done to make those sorts of conclusions. So locational marginal prices are very interesting because they vary with time and space, and they allow us to get all sorts of really cool looking maps like this one right here. This is for MISO, and this is showing at a particular time, 10:20 a.m. This was May 12th, 2012, I think. 10:20 a.m. If you just kind of get that image in your head, and now I'm going to change this to 10 minutes later, same day, 10 minutes later, looks quite a bit different. Locational marginal prices have changed. Okay, so that means a lot of things have changed in the power grid. One of the things that has changed, in addition to likely congestion and other transmission conditions that are going on, is the generator in these regions, the marginal generator, is changing. The cost of energy has changed dramatically in those 10 minutes. In most regions of the country, we can get information like that at 5-minute intervals. So I'm not going to go through the algorithm, but I'm going to mention that, that the tool is available right now. So this tool is available, And one of the questions we're grappling with is how to make this tool available. So for 3 of the ISOs, that is MISO, New York ISO, and PJM, we can provide this information. If you enter your zip code or your address or whatever it is, we can tell you with 5-minute accuracy the marginal generator at that particular time for your location. Okay? So it costs a lot of money, however, to keep the databases and all this information. So you have to charge for it, or somebody else has to pay us to do that. Right now we have a sponsor, Great Lakes Protection Fund, but that won't be forever. So what we're looking at is ways to actually get revenue for this information. This is our website. We have different packages. Right now, as I mentioned, we have, this is the portion that we have covered, MISO, PJM, and New York ISO. We're working on our next version that we hope soon will cover the entire United States. Our next zone is New England ISO and California ISO. We did do a case study using our environmentally sensitive electricity in Detroit, and we looked at the DTE service area, and what we were trying to figure out is this. If people had information and used it like this regarding marginal emissions associated with their energy use, and the other information we provide people is if you wait, whether it's if you wait 10 minutes or if you wait 1 hour or if you wait 2 hours, using day-ahead information, we can tell them what is the likely marginal generator and will it change? In other words, would there be advantages to waiting till next hour in terms of marginal emissions? So we looked at this case study, and all we wanted to do in this case study is look at best and worst cases. What I mean by that is we looked at what if people had this information and they used it in the most environmentally sensitive way, that is to reduce emissions. The worst case would be somebody has this and they want to turn Detroit into a smog nest, and they want to use the information in the worst possible way. So what are those two extremes? And we looked at a typical home in the DTE service area, and we focused on a few appliances that we considered to be more flexible than others. And the ones we looked at were the dishwasher, the washing machines, the water heater, and the refrigerator. And we gave people information about all these sorts of things. This is a typical, we allow people to sign up for an email, and we send an email like this to them every morning at 6 a.m. that says, here is your marginal electricity emissions forecast for today. And it shows them real time at 6 a.m., but then predicted for the rest of the day. And these are, I guess, pentagons. There's 5 elements in each of these icons because we have 5 pollutants we're monitoring. And the color will give you an indication of how serious the marginal emissions are at that time. So this is the results of the case study. We looked at these 5 different types of appliances: water heater, defroster, dishwasher, clothes washer, and dryer. And we looked at best case, which is the blue, which is showing you reductions that could be achieved from the average type of user use. And then the red is the worst case if somebody was out to do something and use it in a bad way, or just time things in such a way that emissions were worst. And so you can see significant savings. I am getting a note here that I'm about out of time, so I do want to save time for saying thank you. This is our team. So again, thanks to EDF and New York University Law School. This was after a really fantastic Chinese meal, and they all say thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Suzanne Russo. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Pecan Street, Inc. Pecan Street is a nonprofit organization that's headquartered in Austin, Texas. We've been around for about 5 years and are pretty well known for different field trials and demonstration projects that we've carried out around the country, mostly in the residential sector, but we do have some participation from small commercial buildings as well. I'm going to talk about, sorry, these are some of our corporate partners. I'm going to talk today about a pricing trial study that we did, and then some of the different consumer technologies that we think helped our participants to really benefit from time of use pricing. So our experiment involved about 250 households. We broke them into 6 groups. One was a pricing trial group. That's what I'll focus on today. We also had a control group and then 4 different behavioral trials. I'm not going to talk too much about the results of our behavioral trials. So those were interventions that did not involve any kind of monetary gain or loss for the participant. But some of that data does come into play when we look at what are the technologies that seem to be most effective at helping people respond to requests, either through pricing signals or other interventions to shift their load or save energy. So the main crux of our pricing experiment involved a critical peak price that was set significantly higher than the average flat rate for our participants in Austin. And this price was triggered during what we call ozone action days. So those are forecasted events where load is expected to be particularly high in Texas due to weather. And people are called upon to reduce their energy use because those are also the periods in which our old power plants, peaking power plants, are taken out of mothballs and brought online, and that energy is particularly dirty. So we use those days because it's something that's broadcast that people are very aware of. There's a lot of public outreach when those days happen, and we were able to let people know a day ahead when that pricing would be in place through text messages that were sent to them. Our objective was really to understand how do people respond to pricing signals? What are the most effective means to get them to shift their load out of peak consumption periods and also into periods where the energy would be coming from cleaner sources? So for this study, that involved a wind enhancement period, which was virtually free energy during nighttime for 5 months when the energy is supplied by wind power plants out in West Texas. So it was a very clean source, and we wanted to see would people respond to that economic opportunity and help us contribute to a cleaner environment, or would they respond more to a stick approach where we put into place critical peak pricing during these ozone action days? I wanted to give a little bit of information on the people that participated in these studies. We are a volunteer-based program, so it is a little bit of a self-selecting group. We have quite a high population of early adopters, so those are folks who have higher income, higher education. They tend to be more technologically savvy. Sorry, I heard singing. So it's not necessarily your average participant pool. However, we have found that the results that we see in our field trials are indicative of what you're going to see with broader populations. One thing particularly to note is that about 50% of the folks in our pricing trial did have electric vehicles. And as a couple of people already talked about earlier in the day, electric vehicles are a large load that we found to be easily shiftable, so that did contribute to the results that we received. We did not do our pricing trial through the utility, so this slide is a little bit blurry, but what I'm showing you is that we set up a portal where we allowed folks to see their pricing on a weekly basis. So we reflected their bill using our critical peak and wind energy pricing structures and compared that to the bill that they were going to receive from their utility. We gave each participant a $200 credit at the beginning of the study. The study lasted 20 months. And if they lost all of that credit, which was the difference between the bill that they would have gotten from us versus a utility bill, they didn't have to pay anything back to us, but they were able to earn up to $700 over the course of the study. So it was considered an economically valid study because people did have skin in the game. It was a real financial incentive for them. And so after the 20-month period, these were the results that we saw. Anybody under $200 left meant they would have had a loss on their bill with the critical peak pricing compared to the flat rate that they had with the utility. But we did have about 15% of our participants that would have gained significantly through this pricing structure. Only 3% of the participants actually used up their entire $200 credit and would have gone negative. But what we saw was that about 38% of our participants did shift load out of those peak periods, so 3 to 7 p.m. in the afternoon. That's pretty astounding compared to other similar studies that we looked at when we were setting this one up. People tend to get about 10%. That's really what we thought would be a good result when we began this study, is if we saw a 10% shift in load as a result of these pricing structures. So we wanted to understand what was driving that kind of result, because it actually just didn't seem valid to us. And what I've listed below are 3 of the behavioral trials that we had going on, just so you can see a sense of comparison. When we sent out actionable text to people, which was something very specific, like, please don't use your clothes washer and dryer from 3 to 7 p.m. today, we saw an almost 9% shift in load across the 20-month period in response to those specific requests for some kind of behavior change. When we sent out a generic message, it just said, please conserve energy today, please conserve energy over the next 2 weeks. We saw about a 4% reduction in use as a result of that. And then we had a smart thermostat trial as well, and we saw about a 4% reduction in energy use after those thermostats were installed in the homes of those participants. So those are actually pretty impressive results on their own, that you can achieve those kinds of savings without needing to undergo a rate case and engage in new pricing structures. However, they really pair in comparison to the opportunity you have with that 38% shift. So why were our results so different? The answer, we think, are the enabling technologies that were in place in a lot of these homes. Some of those technologies were in the homes as a result of previous field trials we'd done, where we did incentivize the purchase of PV systems and electric vehicles. We incentivized folks to acquire smart thermostats. They were primarily Nest thermostats. And then we had some different studies we were doing with some of our corporate partners to analyze smart appliances and programmable appliances. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these technologies, but if you have questions about them, hopefully we can get to that during the discussion portion of the session. So the first enabling technology is information platform. This is really the basis, we think, of any effective pricing or behavioral intervention program, is people need to understand what energy they're using during those peak period times. This is what you would see if you had 1-hour interval smart meter data. So you do get a sense of how you're using energy throughout the day, which is a lot more effective than just your monthly utility bill, where any kind of granularity is hidden from you. However, with the data that Pecan Street gets, you're really able to understand what's driving that load and where are your opportunities to respond to pricing signals. The instrumentation we use is pretty involved. It requires a master electrician, and you clamp CT collars around the circuit of a breaker box. So this isn't something we're advocating that utilities try to go out and put into people's houses, because that's not really feasible, but it is a kind of consumer product that could be considered for utility rebates. It does have direct conservation benefits, and it also provides useful information back to the utility that they can use to design new programs. Pecan Street uses this data as well through an app that we offer for free to any participant in our study, where they're able to get this kind of information in real time about how much energy they're using, what it's costing per appliance, how do they compare to similar homes, added value information that's a lot more actionable than just seeing what you're using. However, our research has shown that when you provide this kind of feedback to people, you get about a 1 to 5% reduction in energy use, which is something, but it's not as significant as other technologies or other opportunities that you would have. So this kind of technology in and of itself isn't something that is necessarily going to drive significant conservation, but we think it's a really important tool that enables folks to make decisions with other technologies in their houses that can, in aggregate, lead to very significant savings. And I wanted to just draw out one point as well. We have about 140 affordable apartment residents that take part in our studies. Those folks tend to utilize their technology to understand their energy use much more aggressively than our higher income participants. They also are much more involved in energy management when they have this kind of information available to them. So we do frequently see that converse relationship between income and energy savings in participating homes. And then just again, once you just provide this kind of direct outreach to folks based on information that you can get from that kind of monitoring technology, you can at least ensure at least a 4% reduction in energy use, but you can very easily double that savings as well, just by turning that data into something that takes less thought, takes less personal interaction with your data, and makes it easy for people to make a simple change in their lifestyle. Programmable appliances I'm going to talk about next because those tend to be more readily adapted in homes. They're more common. They're also kind of easier to use than anything else that we're going to look at today. So programmable thermostat is something, a programmable appliance is something that you have a manual feature that allows you to delay or time when you want that appliance to run. So I have a 4-hour delay button on my dishwasher, very easy to press and make sure that my dishes aren't getting cleaned during peak hours, that's going to happen at the night. One of the main benefits of this kind of technology is that people have control over it. So compared to a smart appliance, which is going to have some built-in intelligence that should be able to respond on its own to pricing signals, you're in control of what happens with these appliances. So people tend to be much happier with how they operate and with that experience that they have in their home. However, you can't do anything about that if you're not at home when you get a peak pricing signal, for example. So smart appliances and smart thermostats, these were going to be the holy grail for smart homes and something that enabled people to really participate in different time of use pricing structures, to have their home really be more of a controllable load for utilities to manage and plan for. There are some significant technology hurdles that we have consistently experienced in trying to run field trials with smart appliances and smart thermostats. Specifically, utilities will send pricing signals over Zigbee through the meter to a home gateway or smart appliances. Zigbee is a very complicated standard with multiple iterations. Within each iteration, the standard is often interpreted in different ways by different manufacturers. We found it virtually impossible to successfully pair a smart appliance with a smart meter. And then oftentimes when they are paired, the consumer just really does not like the experience. They don't like trying to go get their clothes out of the dryer and they found out that the dryer shut itself off because it got a pricing signal that elevated what the cost would have been. These technologies do have a lot of promise, but there needs to be a lot more work that happens in figuring out the communication protocol that operates them, and also in understanding what consumers want out of these systems. And that's something Pecan Street does with a lot of our partners, but there's a way to go. I was asked to talk about some of the alternatives initially to AMI meters that would enable utilities to implement time variant pricing. Thank you. And there really isn't anything. However, utilities should send out their pricing signals or make them available over API in addition to just sending it out over their meter, because then smart appliances in the home could fetch that information. It's not something that can replace Zigbee because you can't rely on all of your customers to have Wi-Fi. That's just never going to happen, most likely. But where you have a home that has smart appliances, that home probably also has Wi-Fi, so that would solve a huge technology problem that we're experiencing right now with enabling homes to respond to pricing signals. I'm going to move on. So electric vehicles. Again, this is a very large shiftable load. Electric vehicles are seen by a lot of utilities as a challenge to manage and plan for. However, we've seen that they can really serve as an asset to flatten out those peaks and valleys in a residential load profile. And when the technology gets there, they'll also most likely be able to serve as a source of energy storage within the home that can feed power back onto the grid during critical peak times. So this is just something we wanted to highlight as an interesting outcome of our study, and what we think really drove home that 38% was how much the folks in our study responded to their pricing signals simply by shifting the time that their electric vehicle charged. There's an automatic button both within the car and on the EV charging station within their home that just allows you to do a simple 3-hour delay. Virtually nobody was doing that before we started the pricing trial. About 2 months into it, everybody was doing it. And we heard that was because a couple people in the neighborhood had figured it out and they let everybody else know who had an EV how to do this. So with just a little bit more consumer education at the time of purchasing these cars, you'd probably automatically see that load shift significantly out of those peak times when people are getting home and plugging in their car more into the evening and nighttime hours. I'm not sure if you can see the text below these graphs, so I'm going to explain it really quickly. The pie charts on the bottom, that 32%, that's the percent of folks who were charging their vehicles outside of peak time when our project started. 68% were charging during peak time. By the end of our project, that had shifted to 45% of the charging instances occurred during peak time, and 55% occurred outside of peak time. The difference in the red and blue lines on the top bar chart shows the savings that our participants were able to achieve by those who had electric vehicles, which are the blue. So you can see that's a lot higher. They saved a lot more money than folks who didn't have electric vehicles in this pricing trial, and those are the folks in the red. And one other element that I did want to discuss, which isn't typically considered and consumer-enabling technology for responding to pricing signals, are photovoltaic systems. What we're looking at here is the difference between power that's pulled from the grid and then power that's supplied back to the grid by homes with PV systems. On the right side, the green there, you see that there's a much lower, a smaller red dip. So that means more of the power generated on site at that home was used within the home rather than being delivered back to the grid. And that's because those panels face west instead of south, so they align better with peak consumption within those homes. Time of use pricing has the ability to perhaps supplant utility rebates for PV systems. So this could actually be a really wonderful tool for folks who have already invested in PV or who are considering it in a time when many utilities are contemplating whether or not they want to continue offering these rebates for systems that are seen to create a lot more challenges for them in managing their overall energy grid. But if you have time of use pricing, it still enables these people to get a significant return on their investment, even if you're not providing them with an upfront rebate or incentive to purchase them. And then finally, I don't think any conversation will be complete without briefly touching on residential storage. Even though it's not commonly adopted, storage is going to probably in the next year or two end up on an adoption curve that's similar to PV. So the technology is becoming more sophisticated, it's becoming smaller and cheaper. Folks are going to start adopting residential energy storage at an exponential rate over the next 3 to 5 years. And when that happens, you can see that the demand just totally is altered for what the utility is supplying. And again, if you have in place time-variant pricing, this really helps provide a financial incentive for folks to invest in these technologies that add overall stability to the grid. And that's it. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. So as a reminder, if you have questions, please write them on the cards, and the cards will be brought up front. So in the interim, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I'll start off with a few questions myself. So I'm going to start with Carol, because reflecting that I teach some upper year environmental law classes. I wanted to, you said in your presentation that you reject the arguments that time variant pricing, has detrimental consequences from an environmental perspective. And I was
just, could
okay.
Are you a lawyer? I got to be real careful here.
Well, I'm a law professor, but I'm not on the stand. I'm not deposing you.
Because, right after the morning session, I was looking forward to a real relaxing lunch with some other speakers. And that I wasn't, as an engineer, I wasn't as prepared to make a clear statement on a particular policy issue, which I'm usually not real comfortable doing. And I don't think that I said what you just, what I said is that people who make that argument don't understand the premise of the argument, and I don't agree with the argument. So I'm not sure if that's the same as refuting, actually, but I don't agree with the point. I hate to be so slimy up here about it, but it depends what pollutant you're looking at. You can't, there are certain times that you're going to be increasing the output of greenhouse gas emissions, but you're going to be decreasing the pollution of something else, because each type of fuel that we burn is a mixed chemical composition. So the point I'm making, and I'm 100% adamant about this, is that the argument that time variant pricing is going to damage, or is going to cause more emissions? I say no.
Okay, actually, my question,
Okay.
I really just wanted to hear you kind of clarify or amplify your
Okay.
comments, so which you just did. And from an environmental perspective, how would you analyze the environmental consequences of time-variant pricing? Like, what factors would you look at?
It wouldn't be that hard. In fact, I was just writing notes that, it's just, get a graduate student to do that. Because what you would do, what we could do, MISO is one of the geographic regions that we have the most information on. And what it would, and MISO does not have real-time pricing. What we would be doing is we would be looking at what the emissions are under the current use conditions, and then assuming time variant pricing is put in place, and we'd have to make a lot of assumptions regarding how people follow the time variant pricing and so on. But basically you would do a simulation. In one case you have time variant pricing and you compare that to the condition without time variant pricing. And so you could really begin to answer that question in terms of how much the benefit is, if there's a benefit, or what. But all I'm saying, but it would be very easy to refute somebody who says that time variant pricing increases environmental degradation. There's
Okay.
It's not true.
Okay, so great. So now I'm going to move to the questions from the audience, of which there are a number. So the first question is, what is the panel's opinion on the use of residential demand charges to efficiently reflect the time value of reductions, time and price value of reductions? And I guess this is a related question. Would low-income customers be impacted negatively with residential demand changes for delivery? Do you want to maybe start?
Sure. Residential demand charges are really use the same principles as time varying pricing. It's all about, attributing the costs to those customers who cause them. I think that residential demand charges are a really good way of utilities recovering their fixed costs, especially in regions where there's a lot of rooftop solar penetration. And I don't think that low-income customers would be particularly vulnerable to residential demand charges because, first of all, we keep saying that those customers have flatter load profiles. That means that they wouldn't have a higher sort of demand to begin with. But even if that is the case, they would pay their fair share of the cost. So I don't really see any sort of issues with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a maybe related question. For education of low-income customers, is the frequency of exposure to energy savings more important than with other customers?
I think so, because the bills, the monthly electricity bills that the low-income customers pay represent a larger portion of their monthly income. And so that means that they have intrinsically have more motivation to respond to the prices. And if they see that their actions are turning into bill savings, that they could be a positive enforcement, and then they could continue to take those actions. And again, I think that low-income customers would have additional sort of boost from this kind of positive reinforcement.
Okay. Carol, this is for you. Have you surveyed all U.S. utilities to determine what type of power plant is called when it is marginal? What is the fuel mix?
The fuel mix, the marginal generator is dependent on time and space. So there's no way to say that, in other words, to say, well, in New England, the marginal generator is always blah, blah, blah. Or in Michigan, where I live, the marginal generator is always this or that. The marginal generator varies in time. So maybe I don't understand the question, but if you knew in advance that the marginal generator was always going to be a certain type, let's say, then there wouldn't be any advantage from shifting demand or anything of that sort. So I'd be happy to talk with whoever asked that question later, but the whole point of what we're trying to do is to say that marginal generators vary in space and time, and we need to get that information regarding what is the marginal generator and then use that to determine marginal emissions. I might also mention that the people who do know what the marginal generators are, they could publish it, the ISOs. The ISOs do not make that public. The ISOs know what the marginal generators are within their system. They don't publish it, so everything we're doing is a sort of a reverse engineering to get at that.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I think this one is also for you, Carol. What role do you see the LEMCO tool and its information playing? Is it to deliver emission reductions directly or primarily to inform people about the need for policy to regulate this pollution?
The LEMCO is the business-facing tool, and it's for people, it's for companies like Whirlpool. We've been talking with Whirlpool, and one of the things we're talking about is a way to give the signal that would go, that would already be captured by the smart chip technology that's already in the smart appliances. It wouldn't cost Whirlpool any extra money because they already have, it wouldn't cost them any extra on their existing line of smart appliances because they already have the chip enabled there. So so LEMCO would be a route for them to buy the data stream that would go to that chip that would enable the smart appliance to be able to respond in an environmentally sensitive way. For homeowners, we have something called HERO, Home Emissions Readout, that gives the homeowner information about marginal emissions. That's a free product. And I forget what the question was, but sorry.
What's the, okay, the role of LEMCO. Okay, I think you got that. Okay. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to quite read this question, but there was mention of time variant pricing as supplanting utility incentives for V variance? Potentially. Could rate variance become so substantial that it could be supplanted? This is maybe a question.
I'm not following that question.
Okay. Okay, somebody wants to write in to elaborate on that question. Okay. This is going back to the initial question that had two parts to it. I don't think we talked about the first part, which was really for the whole panel, so maybe Suzanne wants to take this question. What is the panel's opinion, again, on the use of residential demand charges to efficiently reflect time and price value of reductions? Suzanne, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I think that's a fine option. I think what we're all in agreement on is that time variant pricing can be a very effective tool to shift demand outside of your peak periods. There's not a lot of downsides except for perhaps some environmental ones that are yet to be understood but are going to be very regionally specific and should be studied on a regional basis. Did I summarize that? Yeah. Really? The only thing I would contemplate, though, is that if you're just adding a residential demand charge instead of necessarily putting into place time variant pricing, that can be trickier for folks on a fixed income to be able to accommodate. So I would, if you're asking about one or the other, residential demand charges versus time variant pricing, I think time variant pricing is a much more effective tool, and it's also a more socially equitable tool to probably achieve the same end goal.
I also would like to add that so residential demand charges and time varying pricing can coexist because there's another rate type called three-part tariff. There's a there's a fixed charge to account for fixed costs, and there's a residential demand charge that sort of captures customers' sort of specific costs to the grid. But then there's the variable charge, that variable charge can be made time varying. So it's not that time varying pricing and residential demand charges cannot coexist. They can coexist. And they're partly addressing different problems. They're still trying to get to more efficient pricing, but residential demand charges become more and more important when utilities are really worried about increased penetration of rooftop PVs and the cost shifting from rooftop PV owners to those customers that do not have those PVs, and it's more of an equity issue from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Can I say one thing about that?
Sure.
So just on the case of addressing different classes of customers with residential demand charges, I think that once you have a high enough adoption level of PV within any service territory, it is going to make a lot of sense, and it's almost going to be incumbent upon utilities to look at different pricing structures. So wholly new ways of charging and evaluating the cost to serve customers, something that is probably more along the lines of cell phone bill fees, where you just have a different class of service. If you want to receive or supply back to the grid, X to Y amount of energy, and then Y to Z, those are different tiers of cost to you on a monthly basis. So I think right now, time variant pricing and adding in a residential demand charge specifically to address people with PV who are able to, if they have properly installed and configured PV systems, probably gain a lot from time variant pricing, but end up costing the utility a little bit more to serve because they create so much more distortion and disruption on the grid that's serving them, that is a great tandem way to address both of the issues that we're talking about.
And one last thing on this issue. Just like the issue of time varying pricing being introduced as unfair to low-income customers, whereas it's more of flat rates being unfair because they're making low-income customers or customers with low flat profiles subsidizing those peaky customers. It's the same thing is also true for the residential demand charges. We hear that, residential demand charges are not good because then, how about low-income customers? It's actually going to benefit low-income customers more because then they won't have to subsidize the rooftop PV owners who are likely to have higher incomes.
So both of you have strongly emphasized that time variant pricing doesn't necessarily have to have a detrimental impact on low-income customers. So I'm curious here, who do you think it could have a detrimental impact on? Sure. Is it middle-income people, or is it maybe not based on income that we should be thinking about who might be the losers of this kind of policy?
I mean, I think that it could be detrimental to those customers who have peaky profiles, but they're not willing to change their consumption habits. That, if someone has, pool pumps and spa in their home, and they really like to sit in a cool home, but they're not willing to do those little things such as, pre-cooling or maybe working their pool pump during off-peak hours, those people will be hurt under time varying pricing. But again, that's their choice. They prefer, to do the things their own way to save on their bills. There's this other customer group, vulnerable customers, those people who need to have their, maybe their devices to help them with their health care issues. Those customers can definitely be excluded from these programs. So I don't think that they would necessarily be hurt under time varying pricing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was going to make the point about individuals with home health care equipment as well, because that is something we've seen quite a bit of. We work with a fairly large senior population as well, and I think it is important to acknowledge that it's not only going to be about people making the decision to save energy during peak periods, that there are going to be situations where people aren't able to make that decision and they aren't able to accommodate that increased price on their bill. So it is very important to continue to think about ways to accommodate that, even though the research is showing that most people will benefit from time variant pricing. I'm leaving it there.
Okay. Okay, this is a question for you, Carol, about the marginal generator. How are the fuel production-related emissions accounted for? For example, in the case of nuclear power, it involves externalities for all stages of fuel processing, uranium refining to waste storage.
Great question. That's a great question. I'm not. We don't account for that. We're not doing a life cycle analysis. So that's not what our product is. What our product is to deal with the issue of direct emissions from electricity generation. We're looking at expanding this into a whole life cycle analysis where you track the development of the fuel, the actual mining of the fuel, all environmental costs associated with that, and so on. And there are a lot of people actually looking at that sort of the upstream portion of that. But to be very clear, we definitely don't do that, and so that's not part of the model at all.
Okay, another question. I think this is for you, Carol. Putting aside the marginal emissions, the price reductions in the conventional system resulting from successful time-variant pricing will impair the competitiveness of clean alternatives. Has anybody, or this may not be for you, has anybody modeled the impacts of this side effect of successful time-variant pricing?
That it would make clean energy more or less competitive?
It would make it less competitive. Putting aside the marginal emissions, the price reductions in the conventionals in the system resulting from successful time-variant pricing will impair the competitiveness of clean alternatives. Yeah.
I personally am not concerned about that issue because one of the advantages of clean energy alternatives at the residential or the on-site level is that you're locking in your electricity rate. And that's a big benefit, is that you will continue to have variability in electricity rates that are supplied by the grid over time. That's unavoidable. Additionally, with the cost curve that we're on right now for PV, it's just going to continue to go down. I read the other day that it's reached cost parity in 36 states already. So you will see some overall cost reductions on the grid side once you put into place time-variant pricing, but I don't think that in the long run they're going to be significant enough to really hurt clean energy competitiveness. And if they are, that's the market. So let's make more efficient clean energy technologies.
And also, it's true that demand response, reduces. Demand response has a potential impact on wholesale market costs, prices, and it reduces the prices in certain hours. But it'll take us a long time to get to a pricing curve with really homogeneous distribution. So I think that there will always be some good deal of variation between peak and off-peak prices, and I think that'll be sufficient to keep those technologies still attractive from adopters' perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Senem, I think this might be a question for you. Con Ed of New York has high electricity prices. Their monthly bill involves many components, of which the usage cost, kilowatt hours, is often about 1/3 of the total. Doesn't this billing structure inhibit the use of time-variant pricing, since the customer can only influence a small fraction of his or her bill?
That's a good point. It's the current practice. A lot of the costs are really rolled into the fixed price component. So, in other words, the variable price component that we see does not include all the variable price, the factors that cause the variable prices. So, I think three-part tariffs could be a really good solution to this, that really allocate the cost components such that those metering and billing related costs would make up the fixed costs. And then there will be a demand charge, and there will be a true variable cost in the bills, and then that variable cost could be made time varying. But the larger you make the variable cost component, the more impact you will get. But it's also very system specific. So not knowing the distribution for the Con Ed area, I can't really speculate. But you will always, as small as that component might be, there is always room for more efficient pricing.
Have any of your pilots or demonstrations touched on bill structure and the impact of bill structure? No, not yet. Okay. All right, well, with all that, I'd like to thank the three panelists very much for your presentations and for coming here today.